Hello, you're watching Talk On, the podcast of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle, Germany. My name is Christoph Brumann.
And I'm Jovan Maud. And in this podcast, we're going to be talking about current research and debates in the field of social anthropology.
And today I have a guest, Philip Demgansky, postdoctoral researcher at our institute. We're going to talk about a book of his. It's just been published with University of Michigan Press, also open access. It looks like this, so a very attractive cover, I would say, and has a grandiose title, Seeking a Future for the Past, Space, Power and Heritage in a Chinese City. So that's lots of big words. But what concretely is this book about, Philip? Can you tell us a bit more?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So this book basically is telling the story. So even despite these grand-sounding words in the title, it's actually a micro-study of an urban neighborhood in the city of Qingdao in northeastern China. It follows the transformations of this neighborhood as it transforms from a effectively urban slum, dilapidated, rundown, occupied by the urban poor, into a heritage site, into a space of historical importance, so to speak. And in this book, I'm primarily focusing on the process. I'm not so much focusing on the outcome or on the process of what is happening while this neighborhood is transforming. And one of the key questions I'm asking is, why is it that in the Chinese context, urban redevelopment projects go wrong? Why do they run into deadlocks? Why do they stagnate? Why do they fail? And I believe that this is an important complement to existing studies, both popular and academic, on urbanization in China that focus on the more spectacular, fast-paced, sort of larger-than-life transformations, which are surely important. But I believe that once you look at more secondary cities, smaller cities, the sort of stagnant projects or the sort of failures of redevelopment is actually quite common. And so I'm in this book looking at what lies behind these kind of stagnations or failures in redeveloping an old urban area.
Wow, that's a lot at the same time. Let's go through this, let's say, layer by layer. It's the city is called Qingdao. What's special about Qingdao?
Qingdao is, in the Chinese context, a special city because firstly, it's very young. It's a city that only has about 120 years of history. It was first designed and built by Germans, actually, by the German Empire at the time. And it was one of the very few cities, or actually the first city in the Chinese context that was entirely planned and built by foreign colonizers. And unlike cities like Shanghai or Guangzhou or Beijing as well, that had foreign concessions, Qingdao was entirely a colony, similar to Hong Kong in many ways. So at the time, the Germans signed a leasehold with the Qing government at the time, stipulating a 99-year-long leasehold. And so it was also the Germans that were competing with other European powers over colonies at the time, and they really wanted to also partake in the scramble for China, so to speak. And they had the ambition of really building a Hong Kong of the North, or sort of a model colony, as they called it. And
it wasn't so long, right? It was only a relatively circumscribed period.
Exactly, and so that's what's quite sort of particular about this situation is that the Germans only stayed for 16 years.
16 years until the end of First World War.
The beginning. So
from
1898 until 1914, then Japan came in and basically just kicked the Germans out.
Mm-hmm.
And then Qingdao was Japanese until 1922.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was returned to the Chinese. So despite this fairly short German historical period, the influence that the German presence had on the city is quite immense in terms of the sort of physical vestiges and kind of the architecture. And that's what the city is famous for today. It's sort of often portrayed as a kind of world expo of architecture and a city with a foreign flair, a sort of international flair.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so that's really what I guess makes Qingdao somewhat special within the Chinese context.
Was it special for you as a German anthropologist studying a former German colony or a German city founded by Germans, more or less?
Yeah, that's a very good question and a very important question as well, particularly because over the course of doing the fieldwork and also when I started presenting some of my work to fellow anthropologists, they would sometimes maybe somewhat mockingly, but sort of maybe criticize me or sort of say, well, how can you as an anthropologist, do field work in a city that was once a colony of quote unquote your country? Aren't you evoking kind of anthropology's unfortunate past or involvement with colonialism? And I think it's important to be reflexive of this. But I think nowadays, as with all anthropology in a way, we have to be reflective of who we are. And I discovered during field work, it was very interesting because I was a little bit worried at the beginning that people might be hostile towards me or they might, I sort of represent the power that once colonized them. So I wasn't sure how local people would behave towards me, but actually it was totally unfounded. Local people were extremely happy almost. They were extremely they didn't think anything of it. On the contrary, they were like, okay, of course you're interested in understanding, your heritage. That's how they would say it in the Chinese context. So it actually opened a lot of doors during fieldwork.
I see.
And I just have to be aware of, how my presence affects my interlocutors, my informants, as, we always have to do. So I think as long as one is aware of this, I think it's fine. And I like to focus on the positive aspect that my sort of nationality and identity brought about during fieldwork.
You didn't study Qingdao in its entirety, but you specifically targeted one neighborhood or one quarter called Dabaodao, which is, as you said, initially very much a slum, or at least initially was, but then kind of became rediscovered as heritage. So what's special about this place? Why the idea to make it a piece of heritage in the first place? What was historic or what was remarkable about it?
Right. So Dabaodao also dates back to the colonial period. It was when the Germans designed Qingdao, they actually separated or divided it into two cities, basically. They divided it into a European town where the Germans lived in, nice mansions, nice villas. And then you had a kind of a stretch of land, which was called a hygienic belt. And that separated basically the European town from the Chinese town. And it was right in the center of the city and sort of at the top of a slightly sort of rising slope. And on the other side of that slope was the first sort of Chinese town that they built, particularly for Chinese living in the colony, because the Chinese residents were not allowed to live in the European town unless they were servants to the Germans. And this neighborhood, this first Chinese town, was given the name Dabaodao based on a fishing village which was located there before, but which was razed to the ground. And within this Dabaodao neighborhood, a particular kind of architecture developed over the years called Liyuan houses. And they basically developed as a result of different types of Chinese migrants from all across China moving to this area. I mean, they came from northern China, from the Shandong inland, hinterland, or even from southern China, and they sort of brought along their own building styles and sort of mixed and matched and built these kind of courtyards, also based on the building regulations imposed by the colonial administration. And so these Liyuan houses emerged, which are basically courtyard-style houses, a bit similar to the northern Chinese hutong house. They're enclosed. They have an enclosed courtyard with one entrance, and but unlike the northern Chinese four-walled courtyards, the Liyuan courtyards are sometimes 2 stories, 3 stories, or 4 stories high, and they've been remodeled, extended, replicated, knocked down, and rebuilt over the past century. And I found out about this neighborhood when I was starting to be interested in Qingdao, and it turned out that this was the only one of these built Chinese, because they built other Chinese towns as well during the colonial era. But this Dabaodao neighborhood was sort of pretty much untouched, or was still existent when I began my fieldwork in 2011. And at the time, it was, as I said earlier, it was very much an urban slum. I mean, it was occupied by the urban underclass, as I call it in the book. And
What kind of people would be
yeah, so you had
typical?
so you had a lot of like you can kind of divide them into two types of residents. On the one hand, you had the so-called local people who had an urban household registration, an urban hukou, as they call it in Chinese, who had either grown up in Qingdao or their factory allocated them a house or a room in this neighborhood. But those were mainly people that had no opportunities to move out. A lot of the people that did have some kind of financial means or that were attached to a good work unit in the 1990s when China opened up the real estate market, so to speak, they moved out. But those that didn't have any means to improve their livelihoods, they were left. So I also call them in my book, I call them the left behind.
Yeah,
the people
a
that
bit
didn't
like the losers of the Chinese economic miracle,
exactly,
right?
exactly. A lot of them were welfare recipients, like people with disabilities, people with lots of complicated family relations, various kinds of people. And about 30% of the residents were these kind of locals. And the other type of residents were so-called migrant workers or outsiders, as they call them, Waidiren, as you call them in Chinese, who moved to the city in the beginning from the mid and late 1990s, early 2000s, when China loosened the restrictions on rural to urban mobility. And because this area was close to the center, is conveniently located, and it was very cheap to live in. Plus, it offered an opportunity for people. There were lots of like kind of food markets in the area, so migrants could work there and live in the same place. In the open kind of the architecturally, the spatially speaking, the sort of open nature of the courtyards made it very easy for them to have children. Like the neighbors could look after the children if they had to go to work during the day or had to job somewhere. So a lot of migrants sort of settled there as well. So that was the kind of situation I found when I started my fieldwork. Like it was, just the sort of the lower classes of urban society were living there.
Lower classes, but bipartite in a way, or divided in the sense that one of them is the lower class with the right to be in the city, whereas the other was the migrants are, well, officially considered temporary and continue to be considered temporary. That's an aspect which you also very much emphasize in the book.
Exactly.
Right?
And I think that's very important because it was interesting that some migrants had been living there for 15 years by the time I started my fieldwork. And they themselves would sometimes even say, well, I'm, local. I have no intention of ever returning, quote unquote, home. Mm-hmm. But in the eyes of a lot of local residents, they were never considered to be legitimate residents. And also in public discourse, in the broader kind of government discourse, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this in a moment, also in the kind of heritage discourse, migrants were not considered to be legitimate residents or people who had legitimate claims to the neighborhood.
Yes. And how did you go about researching this? So you did fieldwork like anthropologists, like we anthropologists used to do?
I did, exactly. Yeah. It is in many ways, I would say, a very classical ethnography. I mean, I just went there into the neighborhood. I rented a room inside one of the courtyards. I lived there pretty much every day. I sort of brushed my teeth in, next to the locals in the communal courtyard water tap. Mm-hmm. I ate with my interlocutors out in the streets and very much followed the rules of ethnographic fieldwork, of moving in there, not immediately asking a lot of questions, just hanging out, trying to build rapport with the residents, letting them see me, trying to understand who lives there, just noting down what people are doing, and then after sort of 3 to 4 months, slowly starting to also conduct some more perhaps structured
in
interviews.
our clandestine way.
Exactly. And I have to say, it worked quite well, I think. So there's something to be said for the traditional kind of approach to doing ethnographic fieldwork, at least in this kind of setting.
Also in cities. Yeah.
Also in cities, and I think
that's good to hear from an urban anthropologist.
I think that it is
that I am
exactly. Yeah. No. I think that's of course. There's different types of ethnographic fieldwork you do in the city, but in my case, I very much started from the ground, from the very micro urban neighborhood, and then expanded my network outwards from there.
Okay, and now the story of the book very much is the story of attempts to redevelop that particular neighborhood. Right. As you said initially already, I mean, for 20 years they've been trying to improve it in various ways, and it never really worked out. So why is that?
I mean, that's a bit complicated answer, because the whole book is really about the various factors that end up contributing to these different episodes of stagnation. I would say that one of the, I mean, let me just pick out one, I think, key factor. I think what's really important, which I'm also, discussing in quite a bit of detail, is this idea of preservation, or what I call the preservation mandate. So what I should probably say here is that after Xi Jinping came into power in 2012-13, a lot of things changed on the policy level. Among other things, I think there has been a kind of a shift in narrative in terms of how China's urbanization is supposed to look like, or what it's supposed to be, away from the purely sort of quantitative mode of urbanization, more towards focusing on qualitative aspects, making it more humane, more people-centered. I mean, all these sort of slogans, which doesn't necessarily mean that it is that, but I mean, that's at least on a policy level. And one of these ingredients, I call them, that is supposed to make urbanization, urban redevelopment better, is to focus on preservation. And the current regime has very much focused on heritage preservation, on not just knocking things down, on subtle redevelopment. They call it Wei Gai Zhao in Chinese. And so when I started my fieldwork, I noticed very quickly that this discourse was becoming ever more pronounced and ever more important. And so it was interesting to observe that for local officials, it was no longer really a choice. That even though it would have made a lot more economic sense for them to probably just knock the whole thing down and build something else, or turn them into residences, as it had happened so many times elsewhere, they couldn't really do this. It wasn't really an option anymore. They had to deliver preservation in some form. At the same time, however, they still had to do something that was economically viable in a market economic sense. So it wasn't, the government had that mandate, the central government, there was that central mandate, but they didn't finance these projects. So that put the local officials into a really difficult situation, and I call it the preservation predicament. In a sense that they had to preserve, but they didn't know how, and they didn't have the means, and the kind of institutional structure didn't provide them with a toolkit to do so. And so that was one of the contributing reasons. I think there's a causal relation between some of the stagnations and the mandate to preserve, and I think that's a sort of an interesting observation. And
it's impressive in that chapter where you go through all these different plans.
Right.
With great fanfare, had been publicized at one stage, but they never came to happen.
Exactly.
So, and that's quite surprising. We'll come back to that, but it's quite surprising in a context where you ordinarily expect, where if it's China, things get done once somebody says, or some powerful enough says, we have to do it that way.
Exactly. Yeah, this is, maybe to just add one sentence here, this is also what I thought. When I started my fieldwork, I went in with the assumption and the intention to study transformation. And when I arrived, people kept talking to me about how everything is just not happening, which I found interesting, and I made that sort of the focus of my research.
Which I found quite revealing to read. Now, the residents you depict as, well, marginalized, you already said that, but basically they're not without rights or not without entitlements. Plus, they're also ambivalent about the place itself. Could you describe a little bit more about that?
Yeah.
So what is the ambivalence? Why don't they... why are they torn between staying and leaving, as many of them seem to be? Yeah,
this applies mainly to the local residents who are entitled to compensation payments. The migrant workers is a slightly different story because they are not entitled to any compensation payments. They are renting their rooms, and once the government decides to kick them out, they don't have a choice. But the local residents, they were
the ones with basically a license to be in the city.
Exactly, with the quote-unquote passport to the city.
Yeah, exactly.
The ambivalence refers to, on the one hand, the kind of emotional attachments to the neighborhood, and I'm trying to engage a little bit here with also some of the works within heritage studies that seem to sometimes oversimplify local residents' emotional attachment to space or to place as being somewhat unconditional, simply on the basis of having grown up somewhere. You feel attached to a place, which is not necessarily the case. And I observed among a lot of local residents that, they did have a lot of emotional attachments, but they're not unconditional. A lot of them also really hope to get rich, because this is, after all, what had happened to so many people in China over the years. The whole opening up reforms were based on urban redevelopment, and a lot of people got rich and
by moving
by getting
being
compensation,
bought out, basically,
being bought out or being given property, new property,
mm.
which they could then sell in the emerging market, and they could use that money to then buy even better property. And so a lot of people had got rich, and so the residents in that neighborhood also felt it was a basic entitlement to basically become to get rich, to lift themselves out of poverty through
just sticking it out, basically waiting for the negotiations to finally yield the sums that would allow them to basically just jump up the ladder, basically.
Problem being that this was no longer the case, even though part of this whole changing the urbanization strategy was to, focus on humane compensation, on fair compensation. Compensation had to be based on market prices now, so they would evaluate the average market price in the area, and then the compensation would be based on that. But considering that these rooms are quite small, even though the absolute sum that they got would be considered quite good compared to maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, but in relative terms, it wasn't enough to even buy a new house in 10 years ago. When they were like negotiating with the government, so they were like, okay, this is unfair. Why did everybody get rich? Why should I get poorer? Why should I not get the same that everyone else got? And especially because a lot of the residents had family, friends who did have these benefits, who had benefited from compensation payments. And so this was really something that also made it very difficult for the local government to convince them and to negotiate with them, because from the local government perspective, it's like, well, we are offering them fair compensation, it's very transparent, but they're still not happy. So what can we do? And
they're still not moving out, which I thought probably also is interesting, because we have heard all those stories of an earlier wave of urbanization in China, where basically the individuals were powerless. They no longer are, right? They have to be compensated, but then they're, let's say, the perspective of compensation is beyond beyond which whatever the state is still willing and able to pay.
Exactly,
right?
That's precisely the case. And I think the paradox comes in, also the dilemma comes in also with the stagnation, with the projects going wrong then, because what I observed was interesting, that a lot of them did want to move out, and as soon as the government gave them an offer, they were unhappy, and they started negotiating. They started being unhappy, and partially as a result of these negotiations, the projects didn't happen. But then, once these projects went wrong, then they were also unhappy that the government wasn't doing anything, which also reflects back on the kind of expectations that people have towards a paternalistic government, which the Chinese government has been. I mean, they taking care, quote unquote, taking care of the
very
people.
Ambivalent situation.
Yeah, so that I think created a situation of structural deadlocks of a situation difficult to come out of.
But what it shows is that these, relatively marginalized people still have agency. And so also has another group of people you focused on, who are also part of your fieldwork you interacted with, the preservation activists. These do exist, right? It's not like that there's no civil society, no possibility to for people interested in a particular subject matter to get together and do something, and these people do, right?
Exactly, absolutely. So I dedicated an entire chapter to these, what I call preservationists. And this is a group of people that I encountered very early on in my research, but I didn't really know who they were in the beginning. I kind of had a loose idea of there being some people that are interested in, let's call it broadly, history and culture, or like history and heritage, perhaps architecture, but that I couldn't fully pinpoint. And I think they themselves seem to have quite a strong sort of identity, common identity, but for me it wasn't so clear like who they were. And I think they really defined themselves because they were a very broad network of people that came from all walks of life, from all different kinds of backgrounds. But as
also
you say,
very different professions, and not all of them necessarily educated in heritage or history, right?
Not at all. So a lot of them had jobs completely unrelated. They were civil servants, hobby historians. I call them, some of them at least. There were some professionals as well. And they did have a lot of agency in a sense that, but this agency is not unconditional. So I think this agency was really there because the government had to preserve, as I said earlier. And these preservationists, they had a certain amount of knowledge about the history of the city, the history of Dabada in particular, knowledge about the architectural types of Liyuan houses. So they had exactly what the government needed in a way. So in that way, they sort of managed to impact and influence the government. So I tell the story of this one book, the very first local book published about Dabadao, that really found its way into the hands of the local officials. And I was told the story that later on, when an official came into a new position, it was a mandate to read that book in preparation of that new post, and apparently, as they said, like it had opened a lot of officials' eyes that there was a history there, and that what these courtyards mean and what these Liyuan houses mean.
So basically, it's a group of people that collectively, I mean, they're not able to really, I don't know, revert decisions, government decisions, but they wielded a lot of influence precisely because they had the authority or the knowledge about something that local officials were held to implement, but didn't know much about, right?
Exactly.
In that way, and plus through pressure in the social media, as you also described, they were able to wield quite a bit of influence, right?
Exactly, and also by being extremely accommodating. So they were not, in a way, they were not dismissive of the government, they were not confrontational. They even allowed local officials to be part of their network. And they were, in a way, if you want to put it like more negatively, they were sort of opportunists in a way, or quite expedient, not very principled. But I don't like that. I think I call it pragmatic and activism.
I would also. I mean, the way you describe it in the book, it seemed pragmatic to me. Also realistic. Let's not expect them to unhinge the Chinese state. I mean, that would be expecting a little too much, I would say. But speaking of the state, I mean, this, let's say, stereotypical image of the Chinese state being almighty and being a very organized state that basically where the bottom is able to implement what the top wants, isn't necessarily corroborated by your book, right?
No, exactly. It's not. I mean, so I think this was very interesting during my fieldwork. When I first started my fieldwork, I was obviously also trying to get the voices of the government in, and that wasn't so easy in the beginning. But then once I had a broader network, I managed to get interviews with people from quote unquote within the government. But every time I was talking to someone from within the so-called government, I felt that the government was just disappearing in front of my eyes, because the people were obviously saying, well, I don't have any say here. I don't have any power. I don't know what the higher-ups want. They would even use the government as if they themselves weren't part of the government in a way. So
the government,
as they would sort of,
as they themselves were elsewhere. Yeah?
Elsewhere, exactly. Sort of delegate power to some higher, abstract location somewhere else. Which made me realize really that how the state bureaucracy works, really, that it is sort of scattered across various kinds of entities, various kinds of departments. And
where there's horizontal competition between different departments in the city administration, right?
Competition, but
don't coordinate there.
Exactly.
Basically, everyone does their own thing.
Competency. I mean, some departments are responsible for this, and others are responsible for that, and they don't talk to each other. Yeah. And ultimately, when things go wrong, which happened a lot in my case, no one wants to take responsibility, and they just want to shift it onto someone else. And this is another reason why a lot of the projects actually go wrong. So it's interesting, as I also narrate, that when finally things got done, they got done because of some really concrete top-down mandates, whether it was projects unrelated to, let's say, preservation, whether it was building of a metro line, or whether it was the central government sent in some kind of a committee to check on the hygienic situation of the city, and they scored badly. So there was a lot of pressure from the top to do something about it. That's when they got things done. But when there wasn't that kind of top-down pressure, the system itself wasn't really able to get things done, and it was
to move things forward. Which I found interesting, particularly this fragmentation as competing authorities within the state or within the municipal government. That so much reminded me of my own field research in Kyoto, where I very much studied the same questions. And where, of course, Japan is a solid democracy, so you would expect things to run differently. But after all, the commonalities between bureaucratic states are quite striking, I think. I mean, I found more commonalities than differences between China and Japan, that specific point as to how urban development and urban preservation are being handled.
Yeah, it's very
So a
interesting.
lot of it is quite parallel, I must say. So based on what you observed, is heritage the cure? Did heritage do Qingdao any good?
That's a big question. Local people, a lot of local people will certainly believe that heritage is a cure, but I would answer this question with no. Heritage certainly isn't a cure, or isn't a panacea at least. So when we talk of heritage, I mean, I'm very much indebted to you and your concept of heritage agnosticism, which I'm very much using in my own work, which basically means I'm leaving the heritage question open as an empirical phenomenon, as an empirical question. So I myself don't really judge whether heritage is a good thing or a bad thing. I let my interlocutors speak. But I also identified some problems that when a heritage discourse, a practice becomes almost ideological, it becomes so forceful and becomes a belief that it can solve urban problems, it can solve all sorts of problems that actually go far beyond the scope and the capacities of heritage, then it becomes problematic because it actually obscures some of the real political, economic deficiencies, systemic deficiencies lying behind it. And people just believe in heritage and just want to do heritage. They don't want to preserve and think, well, that's the ultimate goal. But they don't, as a result, don't actually see that there are some much deeper structural problems behind it. So that's kind of my criticism there, that no, heritage is not a cure, at least not a cure for everything. It's not a panacea. So that's one of the key points also of my book.
So it's the future of the past. That's the title of the book. So let's look a bit of the future, and your own future and my future also has kind of brought us together in a project called Constructing Urban Futures in Asia, a new research group here at our institute, of whom we are both members. So what's your own contribution to that research group? I mean, I should probably say that this is specific in the sense that now we want to look at the professionals and the specialists in the construction sector, like architects, planners, etc., how they go about their business, believing that this will tell us something about the way this enormous urban development boom sweeping across the eastern half of Asia is being conducted. But what your own project is about might still be interesting for our audience.
Yeah, so I mean, this project now as part of the Constructing Urban Futures group is in many ways a sort of a follow-up on what I have been doing in the Qingdao case, in the sense that I'm interested in focusing more on planners, really, because I think this is one of the aspects that's coming a little bit short in my book, because I didn't really spend time with planners in their offices at their workplace. So this is what I want to be doing now in my new project, and I specifically focus on really the urban future in the sense that I'm looking at smartification, at the building of smart cities, at the use of digital technologies in urban planning, and I'm interested in understanding how digital technology is really impacting and also possibly transforming the work and the profession of planning, and how it also transforms the ideas of how planners work, the ideas of what a good urban future should look like. So these are the kind of questions that I'm interested in, and in a way it's a follow-up from what I've been doing in my book. I look at heritage, at the past, but also used as a kind of marker of better development or better sort of urban development. Now I'm really going all in a way, like really looking at like digital technology, which is at least a symbol of urban futures.
Yes, but it's in a different city. It's in Hangzhou, right?
Yeah, sorry, I should have said that. Yeah, in the city of Hangzhou, which is in many ways a pioneer of smart city building in China, with Alibaba being there, the big company, and it was the first city that had a so-called City Brain initiative. So it's sort of at the forefront of smart city building in China.
So thank you very much, Philip. That was an intriguing insight into contemporary urban China, and we'll definitely also be looking forward to what you find out in Hangzhou. Thanks for tuning in today, and I very much hope we'll see you again next time at Talk on Debates in Anthropology.